I've been wanting to talk about this for a while because I think the single most important line in the Marvel Cinematic Universe was almost never spoken. In the original cut of Avengers Endgame, Tony Stark says nothing before he snaps his fingers. He just does it. No keep, no callback, no final words. He takes the Infinity Stones, he snaps, and he dies in silence. That was the version the Russo brothers filmed. That was the version they edited. And for a period of time during post-production, that was going to be the ending of the most expensive film franchise in the history of cinema silence. Then their editor, Jeff Ford, said 6 words in a meeting that changed everything. Why don't we just say, "I am Iron Man"? The Russos have described the moment as instant recognition. They knew immediately it was right. The problem was that they hadn't filmed it. The line didn't exist on any footage they had, so they called Robert Downey Jr. and asked him to come back for one more day of reshoots in January 2019, 3 months before the film's release, to film a single line of dialogue. Downey didn't want to do it. He thought going back to "I am Iron Man" was too on the nose, too obvious. He'd said those words 11 years earlier, in the final scene of the first Iron Man, and repeating them felt like fan service rather than storytelling. It took producer Joel Silver, a longtime friend, to convince him. Silver's argument, which the Russos have paraphrased, was essentially, this isn't repetition. This is completion. The first time you said it, you were announcing yourself. This time, you're saying goodbye. Downey came back. He filmed the line, one take. And here is the detail that turns this story from interesting to genuinely poetic. The reshoot took place at Raleigh Studios in Hollywood. Due to a scheduling conflict, the production couldn't use their usual sound stages. Raleigh Studios was available, and Raleigh Studios happens to be adjacent to the stage where Robert Downey Jr. first auditioned for the role of Tony Stark in 2007. The last scene of the MCU's first saga was filmed next door to the room where it all began. Nobody planned that. It just happened. And sometimes the things that just happen are more meaningful than the things you plan. Yam inevitable, says Thanos, and I am Iron Man, says Tony. Snap, silence. 11 years of storytelling, 22 films, $3 billion in box office revenue, and the whole thing comes down to 6 words spoken by a man who didn't want to say them, written by an editor in a meeting, filmed at a studio nobody intended to use. That is either the most perfect accident in cinema history or evidence that the universe has a sense of narrative structure. I'm honestly not sure which. No, I want to talk about how we got there, because the story of Tony Stark is not really the story of a superhero. It's the story of an actor nobody would hire becoming the most valuable performer in Hollywood. And it mirrors his character's arc so closely that the line between Robert Downey Jr. and Tony Stark became genuinely difficult to locate. In 2007, Robert Downey Jr. was considered uninsurable. That is a specific term in Hollywood. It means No insurance company would cover a production that employed him because his history of drug addiction, arrests, and erratic behavior made him too great a financial risk. Studios that wanted to hire him literally could not, because the insurance companies that underwrite film productions refused to take the bet. He was 42 years old. He had been one of the most talented actors of his generation, the Oscar-nominated star of Chaplin, the magnetic lead of countless 90s films, and he had destroyed his career so thoroughly that the industry had built a financial mechanism specifically designed to keep him out. Jon Favreau wanted him for Iron Man anyway. Marvel Studios, which was gambling its entire future on a character that most casual audiences had never heard of, needed someone who could make Tony Stark feel like a real person rather than a comic book cutout. Favreau saw something in Downey that the insurance companies didn't. He saw a man who had been to the bottom and come back, which is exactly what Tony Stark's story requires. Stark is an addict. Stark is self-destructive. Stark is a man who builds armor because he's terrified of what he is without it. Favreau didn't cast Downey despite his history. He cast Downey because of his history. Marvel put up a completion bond, essentially. They guaranteed the insurance company that if Downey caused problems, Marvel would cover the costs. It was a financial safety net that allowed the production to proceed. And Downey delivered. Not just a good performance, a performance so charismatic, so effortlessly commanding, so perfectly calibrated between arrogance and vulnerability that it launched a franchise worth over $30 billion. The uninsurable actor became the foundation of the most commercially successful entertainment property in human history, which is, honestly, kind of insane when you think about it. Downey's improvisations became legendary. The "I am Iron Man" line at the end of the first film, the press conference scene where Tony reveals his identity, was improvised. The script called for Tony to deny being Iron Man. Downey went off book. He looked at the cameras and said 4 words that redefined the superhero genre. Before Iron Man, superheroes kept their identities secret. After Iron Man, the audience expected something different: honesty, transparency, the refusal to hide behind a mask. Downey changed the rules in one take. I love you 3. 0, 0, 0. The line Tony says to his daughter Morgan in Endgame was something Downey's real son used to say to him at bedtime. Downey brought it to set. The Russos kept it. A private family ritual between a father and his child became one of the most quoted movie lines of the decade. When Downey says it in the film, he is simultaneously being Tony Stark and being himself. The line exists in both worlds at once, and the audience, whether they know the origin or not, can feel the difference between a scripted line and a lived one. The confrontation scene in Endgame where Tony reunites with Steve Rogers after the 5-year time jump and calls him a liar was largely improvised by Downey. The word liar was not in the script. Anthony Russo called it one of Downey's most inspired moments. They didn't do many takes because Downey was expanding himself so fully into the scene that repeating it would have diminished the intensity. The anger Tony feels towards Steve, the betrayal, The 5 years of isolation. The sense that the people who were supposed to be his team abandoned him is channeled through a single word that Downey chose in the moment. Not traitor, not coward, liar. Because what hurts Tony most is not that Steve fought against him. It's that Steve promised to be there and wasn't. And this connects to something I've been thinking about regarding Tony's arc across the entire MCU, which is that Tony Stark's journey is fundamentally about trust. In Iron Man, he trusts no one, not his business partner, not the military, not the government, by the Avengers. He's learning to trust a team by Age of Ultron. His trust is shaken. He builds an artificial intelligence to protect the world, and it tries to destroy it instead. Civil War shatters his trust in Steve Rogers specifically. Infinity War tests his trust in the universe itself. He does everything right and still loses. And Endgame is where he has to decide whether to trust one more time. Let me walk through this in more detail because I think the Tony Stark arc is the single best character arc in blockbuster cinema history. And I realize that's a big claim, but I genuinely believe it holds up. Iron Man, Dos Mil Vuit. Tony is a weapons dealer who gets captured by terrorists and discovers that his weapons are being used against the people they were supposed to protect. He builds a suit, he becomes Iron Man, and in the press conference at the end, he says, "I am Iron Man." The first lesson, take responsibility. Stop hiding. Own what you are. Iron Man Dos Mil Del. Tony is dying. The arc reactor in his chest is poisoning him. He spirals, drinking, partying, pushing away the people who care about him. The second lesson, you can't do this alone. You need Rhodey. You need Pepper. You need people who will tell you the truth when you're too arrogant to see it. The Avengers, 2012. Tony meets the team. He doesn't like them. They don't like him. Steve calls him out. You're not the guy to make the sacrifice play. And then Tony flies a nuclear missile through a portal into space to save New York and nearly dies. The third lesson, Steve was wrong. And Tony spent the rest of the franchise trying to prove that Steve was wrong. Again and again, until the proving became its own kind of addiction. Age of Ultron 2015. Tony creates an artificial intelligence to protect the world. It tries to destroy the world instead. The fourth lesson, good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. The road to hell is paved with vibranium and machine learning. Civil War Totusana of Sexton. The team splits. Tony wants oversight. Steve wants freedom. They fight, not a philosophical debate, a physical fight. Tony discovers that Bucky killed his parents. Steve knew and didn't tell him. Tony calls Steve a liar, not an endgame. That comes later. But the fracture begins here. The fifth lesson, the people you trust the most can hurt you the worst. Not because they're bad, because they're human. And humans keep secrets. Spider-Man, Homecoming, 2017. Tony becomes a mentor. This is quietly the most important film in Tony's arc because it shows him trying to do for Peter Parker what nobody did for him, guide a young person with too much power through the process of learning to use it responsibly. Tony's mentorship of Peter is imperfect. He's overprotective. He's absent. He's doing to Peter exactly what Howard Stark did to him, loving from a distance, through technology instead of presence. But he's trying, and the trying is what matters. Infinity War. Liang Tianling Yi Shi Ba. Tony fights Thanos on Titan. He gives everything. He bleeds. He nearly dies. And he loses. The snap happens. Peter dissolves in his arms. Mr. Stark, I don't feel so good. That line, improvised by Tom Holland, is the most devastating moment in the MCU, not because a character dies, but because Tony has to watch. He has to hold a child who is dying and know that he failed to protect him. Every lesson Tony learned across 10 years of films: take responsibility, ask for help, make the sacrifice, accept imperfect outcomes, trust despite betrayal, mentor the next generation. All of it was supposed to lead to a moment where he could save the day. And it didn't. The lessons weren't enough. Thanos won. Tony lost. And a kid died in his arms saying his name. That's the state Tony is in when Endgame begins. Not angry, not vengeful, broken. He's been adrift in space for weeks with Nebula. He's starving. He's dehydrated. He's writing goodbye messages to Pepper on his helmet because he's accepted that he's going to die. And when Carol Danvers rescues him and brings him back to Earth, his first act is not gratitude. It's rage. He confronts Steve. He calls him a liar. He pulls the arc reactor from his chest, the thing that has kept him alive since 2008, and slams it on the table. Here, take this. You find him and you put that on. Hide. Tony is done. Tony is finished. Tony is going home to be a father because the universe can save itself. And then Scott Lang shows up with a van and a theory about quantum time travel, and Tony has to decide one more time whether to trust. And I want to talk about Scott Lang's role in this film for a moment, because I think it's one of the most underappreciated structural decisions the Russos made. Scott is, by any measure, the least important Avenger. He's a guy with an ant suit. He was trapped in the quantum zone during the snap. He missed the entire apocalypse. And when he comes out 5 hours later by his clock, 5 years later by everyone else's, he is the only person in the universe who has experienced time differently. He's the only person with a data point that suggests time travel is possible. The genius of making Scott the catalyst is that he's ordinary. He's not a genius like Tony. He's not a god like Thor. He's a divorced dad with a criminal record who stumbled into superhero work by accident. And the entire plan to save the universe hinges on his experience in a van. Not a spaceship. Not a lab. Fun. Parked in a storage facility in San Francisco. The most important vehicle in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a 1972 Ford Econoline that belongs to a man named Luis, which is, honestly, the most Marvel thing I can think of. Paul Rudd's performance as Scott navigating the post-snap world is quietly devastating. He walks through San Francisco looking at memorial walls. He finds his daughter's name among the missing. He runs to her house. She opens the door. She's 5 years older. She's a teenager. And Scott, who left a little girl and came back to find a young woman, has to process 5 years of missed childhood in 3 seconds on a doorstep. Rudd plays this with a specific kind of parental heartbreak that I think gets overlooked because the film moves quickly past it. But that moment, the door opening, the daughter who grew up without him, the 5 years he can never get back, is one of the most human moments in the entire MCU. Let me talk about Thor, because what they did with Thor in Endgame was the bravest creative choice in the film. And I've been wanting to break this down for a while. Thor gains weight. He drinks constantly. He plays video games. He lives in a fishing village in Norway with Korg and Miek. He has, by any clinical definition, severe depression. The god of thunder, the most powerful Avenger, the man who almost killed Thanos, he has given up. Not because he's lazy, because he failed. He went for the head, he was supposed to go for the head, and he didn't. And half the universe died because of it. The fan reaction to Fat Thor was split. Some people found it funny. Some people found it disrespectful. A beloved character reduced to a punchline about weight gain and alcoholism. And I think both reactions miss the point. Fat Thor is not a joke. Fat Thor is the most realistic depiction of trauma response in the entire MCU. He failed at the most important moment of his life. And instead of processing that failure, instead of talking about it, working through it, accepting it, he withdrew. He numbed himself. He disappeared into beer and video games and the fantasy that if he just stopped participating, the pain would stop too. This is what depression looks like. Not sadness. Withdrawal. The inability to engage with a world that reminds you of what you lost. Thor's weight gain is not the joke. His weight gain is the symptom. And the fact that the film gives him Mjolnir back, the fact that the hammer still considers him worthy despite everything, is the film's thesis about depression stated in a single image. You are still worthy, even when you don't feel like it, even when you can't see it, even when you've spent 5 years on a couch drinking beer and screaming at teenagers on Fortnite. The hammer doesn't care about your waistline. It cares about your heart. Chris Hemsworth has talked about how much he loved playing this version of Thor. He fought for it. The studio was reportedly nervous about making their most physically impressive hero overweight and drunk. Hemsworth argued that it was the most interesting thing they could do with the character that another film of ripped, confident Thor would be boring, and that showing Thor at his lowest would make his eventual return to form infinitely more satisfying. He was right. The moment in the final battle where Thor summons both Mjolnir and Stormbreaker fat, crying, broken, and still fighting is more heroic than any shirtless training montage could ever be. Because heroism is not looking the part. Heroism is showing up when you look nothing like the part. The question the film leaves you with, was it worth it, is not a question about superheroes. It's a question about fatherhood, about what you're willing to sacrifice so that the people who come after you can live in a world that works. Tony Stark dies so that his daughter can grow up in a universe where Thanos doesn't exist. That's not a superhero sacrifice. That's a parent sacrifice. And Downey, a father in real life, a man who knows what it means to lose everything and Rebuild plays it with a specificity that goes beyond acting. Catherine Langford, the actress from 13 Reasons Why, was cast as the adult version of Morgan Stark. There was a filmed scene where Tony, in the moment between snapping the gauntlet and dying, enters a vision similar to Thanos' vision of young Gamora in Infinity War, where he meets his grown-up daughter. She forgives him. She tells him it's okay. The Russos filmed the scene. They edited it into the cut, and then they removed it. Not because it was bad. Langford's performance was reportedly excellent, but because the scene gave Tony something the film needed to withhold: resolution. If Tony is forgiven before he dies, his death is peaceful. The Russos wanted his death to be unresolved. They wanted him to die not knowing whether his daughter would understand why he did it. That ambiguity, the gap between sacrifice and understanding, is what makes the death devastating rather than comforting. Tony dies without knowing if it was enough. And that's the point. Heroism is not knowing if it was enough and doing it anyway. Now let's talk about Steve Rogers, because I think his arc in Endgame is the one that people have the most complicated feelings about. And I want to dig into why. Steve Rogers' journey across the MCU can be described in one sentence. A man out of time learns to stop fighting and start living. That sounds simple. It is not. In the first Avenger, Steve is a man who wants to fight. Not because he's violent, he's the opposite of violent. He's a 90-pound asthmatic from Brooklyn who gets beaten up in alleys and keeps getting back up. He wants to fight because he believes in something duty. Service. The idea that when bad things are happening, you don't get to sit it out. He becomes Captain America not because of the serum, but because of who he already was. The serum just gave his body permission to match his spirit, but the serum also took something from him. It took his time. He goes into the ice in 1945 and wakes up in 2012. Peggy Carter, the love of his life, the woman he promised to dance, lived an entire life without him. Got married, had children, grew old, and Steve wakes up to a world that moved on while he was frozen. Everyone he knew is dead or elderly. The world he fought for exists, but it's not his world anymore. This is the wound that drives Steve for the entire MCU. Not the war, not the fighting, the loss, the life he was supposed to have, the dance he never got. And every film adds another layer to that loss. The Winter Soldier takes away his best friend's identity. Age of Ultron shows him that he can't imagine a life without war. Civil War takes away his team. Infinity War takes away half the universe. By Endgame, Steve has been carrying this weight for 7 films. He's tired. Not physically, the serum takes care of that. Emotionally, he's tired of losing people. He's tired of fighting battles that create new battles. He's tired of being the guy who never stops, because stopping means confronting what he's lost. The support group scene in Endgame, where Steve sits in a circle with grieving civilians and says, "You gotta move on, but not us," is the most revealing line in his entire arc. He tells other people to move on while admitting that he can't. He's stuck, frozen, not in ice this time, in grief, in duty, in the identity of Captain America, which has become a prison as much as a purpose. Mjolnir. I've been wanting to break this down for a while because the moment where Steve lifts Thor's hammer is probably the most crowd-pleasing moment in the entire MCU. And the behind-the-scenes story of how it was built across multiple films is genuinely impressive. In Age of Ultron, there's a party scene where the Avengers take turns trying to lift Mjolnir. Nobody can move it. Steve tries and it budges. Just barely. Just enough for Thor to notice. Thor's face flickers with concern. Then Steve lets go, apparently unable to lift it. And the moment passes. The Russos have confirmed what fans suspected Steve could lift the hammer in Age of Ultron. He chose not to. He felt it move and he stopped. Because lifting it in front of Thor at a party would have been showing off, would have been unkind. Steve Rogers, in a room full of superheroes competing for bragging rights, quietly chose not to embarrass his friend. That's not a superhero moment. That's a character moment, and it's the kind of detail that makes Steve Rogers feel like a person rather than a symbol. When Steve finally lifts Mjolnir in Endgame during the final battle, when Thanos has beaten Thor nearly to death and all seems lost, the payoff is enormous, precisely because it was set up 4 years earlier. The audience remembers the party scene. They remember the budge. And when the hammer flies into Steve's hand and he starts swinging it at Thanos, the reaction in theaters was unlike anything I've ever experienced at a movie. People screamed. People stood up. People cried. Not because of the special effects, because of the wait, because they had been waiting 4 years for this moment, and the film delivered it at the exact right time when the situation was most desperate. When hope was lowest, when the audience needed a miracle. That's not spectacle. That's storytelling. And then comes Steve's choice. The final choice. The one that divides fans to this day. After the battle is won, after Tony's funeral, after the Infinity Stones are returned to their proper timelines, Steve is supposed to come back. He steps onto the time travel platform. Hulk counts down, and Steve doesn't return. Instead, an old man appears on a bench nearby. It's Steve. He stayed in the past. He went back to Peggy. He got his dance. The reaction to this ending was split. Half the audience thought it was perfect, the most earned emotional payoff in the entire franchise. Steve finally gets to stop fighting. He chooses himself. He chooses the life he was supposed to have. After 70 years of sacrifice, he puts down the shield and picks up a life. The other half thought it was a betrayal. Steve Rogers, the man who never runs, the man who says, I can do this all day, chose to abandon the present and live in the past. He left Bucky. He left Sam. He left the world that still needed Captain America. He chose personal happiness over duty, which is, depending on your reading, either the most human thing he's ever done or the least heroic. I think both readings are valid, and I think the Russos intended both readings. The ending is deliberately ambiguous, not in its events, but in its meaning. Is Steve selfish or selfless? Is his choice courageous or cowardly? Does he deserve peace or does he owe more? The film doesn't answer these questions. It just shows you an old man on a bench with a wedding ring and a shield he's ready to pass on. And it asks you to decide how you feel about it. Chris Evans has talked about filming his final scene with a kind of emotional specificity that reminds me of what Carell described when he left the office. It was emotional, Evans said, but it wasn't sad. It was like the last day of school. You're excited for what's next, but you're also aware that something is ending that you'll never get back. The simplicity of that statement, the last day of school, captures something about Steve Rogers that the film spent 20 hours building toward. He was never a god. He was never a legend. He was a kid from Brooklyn who got very big and very old and finally got to go home. But before Steve goes home, there's one more thing the film does with his character that I think is structurally brilliant. And it involves the shield. Steve gives the shield to Sam Wilson, not to Bucky, his oldest friend, the man he crossed the world to save. To Sam, a counselor, a listener, a man who runs support groups for traumatized veterans. Sam's superpower is not strength, it's empathy. And Steve recognizes that what the world needs next is not another soldier with a shield. It's a healer with one. The moment where Sam says, "How does it feel?" and Steve answers like it's someone else's, is Steve's final act of letting go. The shield was never permanently his. It was always supposed to be passed. And Steve, the man who held on to everything, who couldn't move on, who kept fighting because stopping was too frightening, finally passes the one thing he held tightest. Bucky's reaction is subtle and perfect. Sebastian Stan plays the moment as though Bucky already knew, as though Steve told him beforehand, "I'm going to stay. I'm going to live my life." And Bucky, the man who has spent 80 years having his choices taken from him, understands better than anyone what it means to finally make one. He nods. He smiles. He lets his best friend go, because that's what you do when someone you love chooses to be happy. You let them. Now let's talk about the death that doesn't get talked about enough. Because while Tony Stark's sacrifice gets the funeral, the music, the emotional climax of the entire film, Natasha Romanoff's sacrifice, gets a cliff, a scream, and a cut to black. And I think the disparity tells you something interesting about how the film prioritizes its characters and how the audience responded. Vormir, the planet where you trade a soul for a soul stone. Natasha and Clint go together. They discover the price someone has to die, and then they spend 5 minutes fighting each other for the right to be the one who jumps. I've been thinking about this scene a lot because I think it does something structurally that most viewers process emotionally but don't analyze. The scene is built as a competition not to survive, but to sacrifice. Both Natasha and Clint want to die. Both believe their life is worth less than the others. And the fight that follows two best friends physically struggling to throw themselves off a cliff before the other person can is simultaneously absurd and devastating. It's a fight where winning means dying. And both of them want to win. Natasha wins. She falls, and her death is quick, brutal, and final. No resurrection, no time travel fix, no post-credits surprise. She's gone. The fan reaction was complicated. Many people felt Natasha's death was underserved, that she deserved a funeral scene, a memorial, something equivalent to what Tony received. Tony gets a lakeside ceremony with every surviving character in attendance. Natasha gets a moment of silence on a bench, and then the plot moves on. The argument, and it's a fair one, is that the first female Avenger's death was treated as a plot device rather than a climactic moment. She died to get the stone. Tony died to save the universe. The scale is different. The ceremony reflects the scale, and that imbalance bothered a lot of people. The Russos have addressed this. Their argument is that Natasha's death is intimate by design. She dies alone with only her best friend present on a planet nobody has heard of, for a cause that is personal rather than cosmic. Tony's death is public. Natasha's is private. The film treats them differently because they are different kinds of sacrifice. Tony sacrifices himself in front of everyone. Natasha sacrifices herself when nobody is watching. And there's an argument, one I find persuasive, even if I understand the opposing view, that private sacrifice is actually more heroic than public sacrifice. Tony dies as a hero. Natasha dies as a friend. One of those gets a funeral. The other gets something harder to name. Scarlett Johansson has talked about filming the Vormir scene with Jeremy Renner. She said the emotional reality of the scene, two actors who had worked together for nearly a decade saying goodbye, bled into the performance in ways she didn't expect. It wasn't Natasha and Clint on that cliff. She said, it was me and Jeremy, and that made it harder. There's also a behind-the-scenes detail about the Vormir scene that I think is worth mentioning. The original version had Clint dying instead of Natasha. The Russos filmed both versions in one cut. Natasha falls. In the other, Clint falls. They tested both with audiences. The Natasha version was more devastating, not because Natasha is a more important character, but because her sacrifice felt more like a choice and less like an accident. Natasha's death is deliberate. She makes a decision. She lets go. Clint's version apparently felt more like he tripped. The intentionality of Natasha's sacrifice is what makes it hit harder. She's not a victim of the cliff. She's the author of the fall. The time heist, the central plot mechanism of Endgame, deserves its own discussion because the way it's structured tells you something about what the Russos value as storytellers. The heist takes the characters back to 3 previous MCU films: The Avengers, 2012 New York; Guardians of the Galaxy, 2014 Morag; and Thor, The Dark World, 2013 Asgard. Each destination is chosen not just for plot reasons, the location of an Infinity Stone, but for character reasons. Tony goes back to 2012 New York, and then to 1970 Camp Lehigh. In 1970, he meets his father, Howard, a man he spent his entire life resenting. And in a brief, quiet conversation, Tony gets something he never expected: understanding. He sees his father not as the distant, cold figure of his childhood, but as a nervous man, about to become a parent who doesn't know if he'll be good at it. Tony has already become a father himself. He knows the fear. He recognizes it in Howard's eyes. And for the first time in the MCU, Tony forgives his father, not with words, with a hug. A hug Tony initiates. Between a son from the future and a father from the past, in a hallway in 1970, separated by decades and connected by the one thing neither of them knew how to express: love. That scene, Tony and Howard in the hallway, is the emotional center of the time heist. Not the action, not the comedy. A son meeting his father at the age where they can finally understand each other. Every father who watches that scene recognizes the moment. It's the moment where you realize your parents were just people scared, imperfect, trying their best with insufficient tools. Tony needed to go back in time to get an Infinity Stone, but what he actually got was closure. Thor goes back to 2013 Asgard and meets his mother Frigga, who is about to die. And she sees immediately that this is not her Thor. This is a Thor from the future. Heavier, broken, drunk, defeated. And she doesn't judge him. She doesn't lecture him. She tells him, the measure of a person is how well they succeed at being who they are, not who they're supposed to be. Who they are: fat Thor, depressed Thor, failed Thor. That Thor is still worthy. And to prove it, Mjolnir flies to his hand. The hammer doesn't care about his weight. It cares about his heart. And his heart, despite everything, is still good. The portal scene, this is the one I've been wanting to get to, because I think it might be the single most logistically complex scene in the history of blockbuster filmmaking. And the behind-the-scenes story is just as epic as what ended up on screen. After Thanos destroys the Avengers compound, after he beats Thor and Captain America and Iron Man into the ground, after Steve stands alone against an entire army with a broken shield, the portals open. One by one, golden circles of light appearing across the battlefield, and through them come everyone, every character, every hero, every person who was dusted in the snap, restored and ready to fight. Black Panther, Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, the Guardians, the Wakandan Army, the Sorcerers, everyone. The scene required the coordination of nearly every actor who had appeared in a Marvel film over the previous 11 years. Scheduling alone was a nightmare, getting dozens of A-list actors, each with their own production commitments, into the same location at the same time required months of negotiation. Some actors were only available for a single day. Some scenes that appear to show characters standing side by side were actually filmed weeks apart and composited together. The moment where Steve says, "Avengers. Assemble the line," fans had waited 11 years to hear, was filmed multiple times with different deliveries. Evans did a version where he shouted it. He did a version where he whispered it. He did a version where he just said it normally, like a man giving an order. The version they used is the quiet one barely above a speaking voice. Exhausted, determined, the Russos chose it because after 11 years of buildup, The line didn't need volume, it needed weight. And the quietest version had the shot that follows every hero charging toward Thanos' army. Alan Silvestri's Avengers theme building to its fullest expression. The camera pulling back to reveal the scale of the battle cost more money per second than almost any other sequence in cinema. I don't have the exact number because Marvel doesn't release per scene budgets, but the combination of visual effects, actor salaries, location work, and post-production required to produce approximately 90 seconds of portals to charge footage was, by any reasonable estimate, the most expensive minute and a half of film ever produced. And it earned every cent, because the portal scene is not an action sequence. It's an emotional release. 11 years of accumulated investment, emotional investment, not financial paying off in a single moment. Every character the audience has ever cared about, standing together, fighting together for the last time. The charge is not about defeating Thanos. It's about being together. After a film that spends 2 hours showing you what the world looks like when these people are gone, the portals scene shows you what it looks like when they come back. And the difference, the gap between absence and presence, between loss and recovery, is the entire emotional payload of the film delivered in 90 seconds. Let me talk about Thanos for a moment, because I think Josh Brolin's performance across Infinity War and Endgame represents one of the most underappreciated acting achievements in modern blockbuster cinema. And the fact that he did it entirely through motion capture makes it even more impressive. Thanos in Infinity War is the protagonist, not the villain, the protagonist. The film follows his journey, his motivation, his emotional arc. He believes he's saving the universe by eliminating half of all life. He's wrong catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, but he believes it with absolute conviction. And Brolin plays that conviction with a gravity that makes you understand, even if you can't agree. Thanos is not a cartoon. He's a zealot. And zealots are terrifying precisely because they believe they're right. Endgame's Thanos is different. This is the 2014 version pulled from the past through time travel, encountering the future he was supposed to create. This Thanos hasn't sacrificed Gamora yet. He hasn't completed his mission. He hasn't earned the quiet satisfaction we see at the end of Infinity War. Instead, he watches footage of his future self succeeding and then being undone, and he decides that his original plan was too small. Eliminating half of life isn't enough. He'll destroy the entire universe and rebuild it from scratch. This shift from pragmatic zealot to cosmic destroyer is subtle but important. Infinity War Thanos was sympathetic because his goal, while horrifying, came from a place of genuine concern. Endgame Thanos is not sympathetic. He's angry. He's entitled. He looked at a universe that rejected his gift and decided the universe was wrong. That's not conviction anymore. That's ego. And the distinction matters because it makes his defeat satisfying in a way that defeating Infinity War Thanos would not have been. You can feel sorry for a zealot. You cannot feel sorry for a narcissist. Brolin has talked about the challenge of playing two versions of the same character in the same film. Infinity War Thanos has gravity. Endgame Thanos has rage. The motion capture required Brolin to physically differentiate between the two. Infinity War Thanos moves slowly, deliberately, like a man who has already decided. Endgame Thanos moves faster, more aggressively, like a man who hasn't. The difference is in the body before it's in the dialogue. The famous line, "I am inevitable," was also a late addition. The original script had a longer speech. The Russos cut it to 3 words because they realized Thanos' confidence is the joke. He says, "I am inevitable," with absolute certainty. Snaps his fingers, and nothing happens. The stones aren't there. Tony has them. And the look on Thanos' face, the confusion, the disbelief. The first moment where Thanos does not have a plan is Brolin's finest moment. Not the speeches, not the fights, the silence after the snap that doesn't work. That is the face of a god discovering he is mortal. Brolin plays it with 2 seconds of screen time and 0 dialogue. I want to add one thing about structure before we move on, because I think the way Endgame handles its 3-hour runtime is a lesson most blockbusters refuse to learn. The first hour is quiet. Almost nothing happens. Tony comes home. Steve runs a support group. Natasha eats a peanut butter sandwich alone. Thor plays Fortnite. The world is broken and nobody knows how to fix it, and the film takes a full hour to sit with that brokenness before offering a solution. This is brave filmmaking. The audience came for a superhero epic. The Russos gave them an hour of grief. Not action. Grief. The support group scene. The empty streets, Tony's quiet life in a cabin by a lake. Studios don't want quiet first acts in action movies. The Russos argued that the payoff, the portals, the battle, the snap would only work if the audience spent an hour feeling the absence of hope. If you start with hope, the third act is satisfying. If you start with despair, the third act is transcendent. The difference between satisfying and transcendent is 1 hour of grief. The reason people screamed when the portals opened is not because portals are exciting. It's because they had spent an hour being told nothing would ever be okay again. And then it was. The relief is the emotion, not the spectacle. Now I want to talk about how the Russo brothers managed what might be the most impressive secrecy operation in entertainment history. Because keeping Endgame's plot hidden from a global audience that was desperately trying to find out what happened was genuinely unprecedented. The security measures were extreme. Scripts were distributed on locked tablets that could be remotely wiped. Actors received only their own pages. They didn't know what was happening in scenes they weren't in. Tom Holland was given a completely fake script because his reputation for accidentally revealing spoilers had become so well known that the production team couldn't risk giving him real information. Holland has talked about this with good humor. He's said he showed up to set most days, not knowing what scene he was filming or what was happening in the plot around him. Mark Ruffalo accidentally live-streamed the first 10 minutes of Thor Ragnarok's audio from a premiere screening. After that, Marvel assigned him a handler whose specific job was to prevent Ruffalo from accidentally revealing information. The handler attended press events with him and was authorized to physically intervene if Ruffalo started saying something he shouldn't. Benedict Cumberbatch was given a list of pre-approved talking points for press junkets and was instructed not to deviate from them. Don Cheadle, during a joint interview with Holland, was visibly anxious every time Holland opened his mouth. The dynamic between Marvel's actors and their spoiler protocols became its own kind of entertainment, a meta-narrative about famous people trying very hard not to say things they desperately want to say. The title itself was kept secret until the first trailer dropped. For months, the Russos insisted the title was not spoken in Infinity War, which was technically true. Since Doctor Strange says we're in the Endgame now, but the word Endgame had been used in Age of Ultron by Tony Stark. The misdirection was deliberate. Every public statement the Russos made was calibrated to reveal as little as possible while appearing to be open and transparent. They lied, frequently, tearfully, and fans respected them for it, which is an unusual response to being lied to, but makes sense in context. The audience wanted to be surprised more than they wanted to be informed. The 5-year time jump was the best-kept secret of the production. Nobody outside the core creative team knew. When the film revealed that Endgame takes place 5 years after the snap, that the surviving characters have been living in a diminished, grieving world for half a decade, the surprise was genuine and universal. No leaks, no rumors, no set photos that gave it away. In an era where every major production is photographed by drones and analyzed frame by internet detectives, the Russos kept the central structural decision of their film completely hidden. That is a security achievement that borders on the miraculous. Now let me talk about what happened when this film was released. Because the cultural event of Endgame's opening weekend is something I don't think we'll see again in our lifetimes. Endgame opened on April 26. 2019. It made $1.2 billion in its opening weekend worldwide. Friday through Sunday. That is more money than most films make in their entire theatrical run, compressed into 72 hours. But the numbers don't capture the experience. The experience was the theaters. Sitting in a room with 300 strangers and screaming together when Cap lifted the hammer. An entire auditorium going silent, genuinely silent. Funeral silent when Tony snapped his fingers. Hearing grown adults sob during a superhero movie and not finding it embarrassing because you were sobbing too. I've seen a lot of movies in theaters. I have never been in an audience that reacted to a film the way audiences reacted to Endgame. The portal scene was not watched. It was experienced. Collectively, physically, people were on their feet. People were grabbing strangers. People who had spent 11 years investing in these characters released a decade of emotional investment in a single scream. Theater reaction videos from opening weekend went viral. The videos all look the same. A dark room, a screen, and then an eruption. Pure. Uncontrolled. Collective joy. These videos have been viewed hundreds of millions of times. People watched videos of other people watching Endgame because the reaction itself was as entertaining as the film. The audience became the show. The film also created a specific social norm that is worth noting. For approximately 2 weeks after release, spoiling the plot was treated as a genuine social transgression. The Russos tweeted a letter asking audiences to keep the secrets. Number "Don't Spoil the Endgame" trended globally. People who spoiled the film online were unfriended in real life. The protection of a fictional narrative became a collective social contract observed by millions simultaneously. No other film has ever generated that level of communal protectiveness over its plot. Let me wind down with some of the smaller details, the ones that reward repeat viewing and that most audiences miss on first watch. Tony's funeral. The camera panned slowly across the faces of the mourners. Every character is present, some of whom have never shared a scene together. The camera lingers on each face for approximately the same duration. No character is prioritized over another. In death, Tony Stark is finally equal with the people he spent 11 films trying to protect. The camera democratizes grief. Everyone gets the same amount of time to be sad. There is a teenager standing alone at Tony's funeral. Most first-time viewers don't recognize him. He's Harley Keener, the kid from Iron Man 3. The boy who helped Tony in his garage in Tennessee when his suit malfunctioned. The boy grew up. The actor grew up. And the film places him at the funeral without introduction, without dialogue, without explanation. If you remember Iron Man 3, you know who he is. If you don't, he's just a teenager at a funeral. The film trusts you to make the connection or not. It doesn't hold your hand. That kind of confidence in the audience's intelligence is rare in blockbuster filmmaking. I love you, 3. Ling, Ling. The number is not random. During development, the Russos asked the cast and crew to share real bedtime sayings they used with their children. Downey offered "I love you 3." 000, something his son actually said to him. The Russos tested multiple numbers. They tried "I love you 1,000." They tried other quantities. San 000 was the one that felt right, specific enough to sound like something a child would actually say, large enough to feel infinite from a 5-year-old's perspective. The Ancient One's conversation with Hulk, the scene on the rooftop in 2012 New York, was written as a philosophical argument about the nature of time. It is also, structurally, an explanation of the film's time travel rules delivered to the audience through a character who would logically understand those rules. The scene is doing 2 things at once, telling a story and explaining a mechanism. The fact that most viewers don't notice the explanation is happening because they're invested in the story is proof of how well the scene is written. Steve's dance with Peggy. The final image of the film before the credits. 2 people dancing in a living room. No dialogue. No exposition. Just a song, "It's Been a Long Time" by Harry James and Kitty Kallen, released in 1945, and 2 people who have waited 70 years for this moment. The camera slowly zooms in. They hold each other, and the film ends not with an explosion, not with a battle, not with a universe-saving sacrifice, but with a dance. A quiet, private, ordinary dance in an ordinary room between two people who love each other. I've been thinking about why that final image works so well. And I think it's because the entire MCU, all 22 films, all 11 years, all the aliens and robots and magic and time travel was always building towards something simple. Not a fight, not a victory, a dance, a moment of peace earned through decades of war. Steve Rogers spent 70 years being a soldier. His reward is not a medal or a monument. It's a song and a partner and a room where nobody needs saving. That's Endgame. Not the battle, not the portals, not the snap. A man who finally stopped fighting and a woman who waited for him, and a song that played in 1945 for a dance that happened in some quiet corner of a timeline that the rest of the universe will never know about. And if that image, two people holding each other in a living room while the world outside is quieter than it's been in 70 years, doesn't help you drift off to sleep, then honestly, I'm not sure what will. Avengers Endgame made $2.79 billion worldwide. It briefly held the record for the highest grossing film of all time. It featured the most expensive single battle sequence ever filmed. It required the coordination of more A-list actors than any previous production in cinema history. It was the culmination of a storytelling experiment that no studio had ever attempted, and that no studio has successfully replicated. And the last image is two people dancing. That's the whole MCU. If you think about it, 22 films of gods and monsters, and infinity stones and world-ending threats, and the final message is, the point of saving the world is so that someone, somewhere, can dance with the person they love in a room where nothing is on fire. That's enough. That's always been enough. There's always more lore to tell. I'll be here when you come back. Tony's funeral. The camera pans slowly across the faces of the mourners. Every character is present, some of whom have never shared a scene together. The camera lingers on each face for approximately the same duration. No character is prioritized over another. In death, Tony Stark is finally equal with the people he spent 11 films trying to protect. The camera democratizes grief. Everyone gets the same amount of time to be sad. There is a teenager standing alone at Tony's funeral. Most first-time viewers don't recognize him. He's Harley Keener, the kid from Iron Man 3. The boy who helped Tony in his garage in Tennessee when his suit malfunctioned. The boy grew up. The actor grew up, and the film places him at the funeral without introduction, without dialogue, without explanation. If you remember Iron Man 3, you know who he is. If you don't, he's just a teenager at a funeral. The film trusts you to make the connection or not. It doesn't hold your hand. That kind of confidence in the audience's intelligence is rare in blockbuster filmmaking. I love you 3. Ling, ling, ling. The number is not random. During development, the Russos asked the cast and crew to share real bedtime sayings they used with their children. Downey offered I love you 3. 0, 0, 0, something his son actually said to him. The Russos tested multiple numbers. They tried I love you 1,000. They tried other quantities. San, 000 was the one that felt right, specific enough to sound like something a child would actually say, large enough to feel infinite from a 5-year-old's perspective. The Ancient One's conversation with Hulk, the scene on the rooftop in 2012 New York, was written as a philosophical argument about the nature of time. It is also, structurally, an explanation of the film's time travel rules delivered to the audience through a character who would logically understand those rules. The scene is doing two things at once, telling a story and explaining a mechanism. The fact that most viewers don't notice the explanation is happening because they're invested in the story is proof of how well the scene is written. Steve's dance with Peggy. The final image of the film before the credits, two people dancing in a living room. No dialogue, no exposition, just a song, It's Been a Long Time by Harry James and Kitty Callan. Released in 1945, and two people who have waited 70 years for this moment. The camera slowly zooms in. They hold each other, and the film ends not with an explosion, not with a battle, not with a universe-saving sacrifice, but with a dance. A quiet, private, ordinary dance in an ordinary room between two people who love each other. I've been thinking about why that final image works so well, and I think it's because the entire MCU, all 22 films, all 11 years, all the aliens and robots and magic and time travel was always building towards something simple. Not a fight, not a victory, a dance, a moment of peace earned through decades of war. Steve Rogers spent 70 years being a soldier. His reward is not a medal or a monument. It's a song and a partner and a room where nobody needs saving. That's Endgame, not the battle, not the portals, not the snap. A man who finally stopped fighting, and a woman who waited for him, and a song that played in 1945 for a dance that happened in some quiet corner of a timeline that the rest of the universe will never know about. And if that image, two people holding each other in a living room while the world outside is quieter than it's been in 70 years, doesn't help you drift off to sleep, then, honestly, I'm not sure what will. Avengers Endgame made $2.79 billion worldwide. It briefly held the record for the highest grossing film of all time. It featured the most expensive single battle sequence ever filmed. It required the coordination of more A-list actors than any previous production in cinema history. It was the culmination of a storytelling experiment that no studio had ever attempted, and that no studio has successfully replicated. And the last image is two people dancing. That's the whole MCU. If you think about it, 22 films of gods and monsters and infinity stones and world-ending threats, and the final message is the point of saving the world is so that someone, somewhere, can dance with the person they love in a room where nothing is on fire. That's enough. That's always been enough. There's always more lore to tell. I'll be here when you come back.